This is Chapter 3 of the International Relations class. We'll be talking about institutionalism and other social theories. Here you will see how it contrasts with the realist theory that we talked about in the previous chapter. Institutionalist theories tend to associate themselves with the idea that conflict and war has been waning to some degree over the past several decades, and some scholars will push this all the way back to the period of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when new ideas were forming, particularly those of representation and liberalism and scientific inquiry, hence the liberalist idea that's associated with that as well. But particularly since the end of the Cold War, there have been decreased tensions that were associated with that. And since the Cold War, wars have been generally smaller. We'll get into that in more detail later on, in that identity groups within states have been the source of most conflict. As we'll see here, conflict within states has been much greater than conflict between states. That's something that we will want to delve into and examine that a little bit more. Despite these conflicts, the prospects of a major war have been diminishing. We could say that, yes, it's less likely today to have a major world war similar to the ones that we had in the last century. It doesn't mean that it couldn't possibly happen, but the chances are lower because of this system that we've created since World War II and the increasing interdependence, economic dependence upon each other that have lowered that likelihood. When you look particularly since World War II, a general trend in a reduction in battle-related deaths per 100,000 people. Now, obviously, if we backed up to World War II, this chart would be completely off the map here. But here we see the Korean War, quite a spike there. Then we see another spike with the Vietnam War there. And then in the 1980s, we had some other conflicts going, such as the Iran-Iraq War, the Soviet-Afghanistan War, and various smaller guerrilla-type wars in South America that might have been somewhat socialist-leaning type conflicts versus Western interests. And then we see another spike here with the rise of terrorism, particularly 9/11. And we could certainly argue that in the last decade or so, we've seen perhaps another spike of conflict and violence in the world. The roots of these liberal theories go all the way back, as I said, to the Enlightenment and Immanuel Kant, a philosopher whose writings put the label of enlightenment on that period. So he was quite foresightful, looking at some ideas that could, in the future, create institutions for peace, such as the concept of reciprocity, whereas I will treat you as I would want you to treat me, and then putting that on the state level to where states would treat each other as they would want to be treated. Reciprocity, of course, one of the basic interactions of human behavior that you could certainly argue that everything else pretty much evolved out of that. He was also talking about this Republican character of governments, which is another word for representative systems of governments, where the people have say in who their leaders are, and they may not like leaders who are getting them into war. And then trade promoting interdependence between states has also been a part of that equation, all somewhat predicted by Immanuel Kant's criteria for peace. The concept of institutionalism has several forms, could be called liberalism, idealism, internationalism. Here we're going to kind of lump them all together into a concept of institutionalism. Here's the primary differences between realism, which we talked about in the last chapter, where states are independent, sovereign actors working in their own rational self-interests. Here in the internationalist or the institutionalist system, the states are still the primary actors. However, here we're giving a lot more credence to international organizations, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations as being important sub-state actors in this international system of operation. The institutionalist perspective looks more at the interdependence between actors rather than them pursuing their own self-interests and looking at the mutual benefits of cooperation. States are not necessarily autonomous. They have diverse interests. So that's what the institutionalist perspective is focusing more on. Now, clearly, there's no right or wrong, and that doesn't mean the world is either all realist or all institutionalist. There's a mixed bag here, as well as some overlaying of these concepts. But depending on any particular political ideology at the time, or leaders that are elected at any given time, or authoritarian dictators or whatever, they may prefer a more realist perspective of the world, or they might at some point prefer a more institutionalist perspective of the world. So it could vary depending on what ideology is prevalent at that time or what leaders are in charge. The institutionalist perspective also looked at the idea that states delegate things to the international organizations, particularly if the costs are less than the benefits, in that it's maybe more practical to do that on a global perspective rather than each state pursuing it on its own. The institutionalist perspective looks at the spreading and converging of global norms in somewhat of an incremental evolution of these norms to come together as far as trying to keep peace, protect the environment, women's rights, human rights, disease containment, lots of things that are global in nature that we would converge on certain norms as far as addressing those. We also are looking at if anything is international in nature or a global problem, then decisions would require some form of consensus. And these are questions that, from the institutionalist perspective, could we be evolving towards an international society or some form of globalism? Not likely at this time. In fact, we are probably pushing back against that at this time, but in general, could still ask those questions. It's unlikely that all these diverse cultures in the world would come together under one single human identity. That's probably unlikely, but we could be potentially evolving into more of an international network with some more collective norms that people are coming together on. The term neoliberalism is an offshoot of liberalism that has both negative and positive connotations. It says that, like realists, it's conceding that states are rationally pursuing their self-interests. However, in the process of doing that, states are creating mutual rules and institutions for cooperation, hence the connotation with the institutionalist perspective. And that states are resolving this prisoner's dilemma that we talked about in the last chapter, where if states are pursuing their own self-interests, they could come up with outcomes that are less than optimal than they could have gotten if they had communicated and cooperated. So that means this quid pro quo, also known as tit for tat, which is short for this for that, has become somewhat like a reciprocity, that I'll treat you like you treat me, and that does seem to maximize potential benefits in that regard. Neoliberalism has been typically associated with global capitalism, which is why it gets most of its negative connotations. The world does seem to be moving more into a global capitalist type system. Right, wrong, good or bad has nothing to do with it. That's just kind of how it's evolving, because the adaptability, flexibility of the market systems is one of the reasons why capitalism has survived and other forms such as communism has failed, therefore resulting in this idea of modernization where poor states are trying to tap in to this global capitalist system and improve their standards of living and increase their development. Multinational corporations are taking on more importance in this, which has negative connotations as well because the multinationals are not regulated on a global system and therefore are picking up more power, more influence, and more leverage. They can literally, with their increasing wealth, they can influence their own states to get benefits and then yet go out and work on the global scale somewhat unregulated. So that's something that we'll have to talk about in more detail later on. You could even look at global capitalism as a separate international idea that's kind of parallel with realism and institutionalism. That's why I'll spend so much time talking about the global economy and this globalization, global capitalism, as somewhat of a way of looking at this evolving international system. The concept of regime is contrasting with the idea of alliances that we talked about under the realist perspective, which are states pursuing their own self-interests and they'll align with somebody temporarily as a marriage convenience to try to get something that they need. A regime, however, from the institutionalist perspective, is trying to build a set of rules, converging norms, and procedures on a particular issue, whether it's peace, human rights, environment, women's rights, that are global in nature. So a regime comes together and then starts to grow. And while that regime, it could be starting as a treaty or a conference or even an international organization. Regime is more of an idea of a pursuit of a particular issue on a global basis. And while this regime is dependent on states for being established, once it's established, once it's a treaty or a convention or an international organization, it doesn't need the states to maintain itself because it creates its own body, it creates its own bureaucracy, its own leadership, and then it starts to become its own somewhat independent player in the international system. That's what happens when international organizations are created. Then they develop their own sense of autonomy, even though they're put together and represented by various states sending them their members. They do have their own sense of independence, and we'll get into that more when we talk about the UN. So therefore, this regime becomes embedded in some permanent form of institution, such as the United Nations, where a lot of treaties are started through conventions. NATO, we talked about NATO, World Trade Organization. These are permanent institutions that are looking at certain global issues, therefore creating this regime of oversight or regulation or cooperation. This stable framework can be used for resolving disputes. Certainly not perfect, but at least some form of cooperation that is set up that provides an alternative for conflict. Collective security is another way of looking at cooperation from the institutionalist perspective. Not necessarily the same as an alliance, which states are pursuing in their own self-interest, whereas collective security, states are coming together to jointly oppose some form of aggression. Now, the success of this collective security depends on some things, and that's keeping their commitments. And we do see that states, once they've entered into agreement, they do have a tendency to keep their word and maintain their agreements, primarily to maintain their legitimacy and their credibility in the world, to be recognized as a trustful actor in the global system. So when the states back out on that, they kind of are looked at negatively from the other states and lose some credibility. And then we have to agree on what constitutes aggression, and that could be very difficult to agree on when you've got various different players that are members of that group. The UN Security Council is a good example of this. They have been effective in many times over the years, but they have often split on issues, and they may be splitting a little bit more often because when you see that the 5 permanent members, Russia and China, are more authoritarian systems, whereas Great Britain, France, and the United States are more democratic systems. So that could be a split that could be widening there, less able to agree on certain things to provide security around the world. That's been an issue from the very start. Even at the end of the Cold War, there might have been some hope that that would kind of heal. But when you've still got these authoritarian leaning versus democratic leaning states, going to have potential for disagreement. And the permanent members, those 5 permanent members of the Security Council, have veto power. So therefore, all 5 of them have to agree in order for anything to get accomplished to send peacekeeping troops somewhere in the world to try to stop a war or suppress violence. Democratic peace theory is an interesting idea that came about in the 90s when several political scientists started to go back and look at all the democracies in the world, going all the way back to the United States, who had the first modern democracy with our Constitution, and they discovered that democracies have not gone to war with each other. So that was a very interesting find that still holds up when you look at all the democracies in the world. And of course, there's areas where we might have a little bit of disagreement on defining whether or not a state was a democracy or not, but there's a strong consensus on this. And this was also predicted by Kant there at the end of the Enlightenment, where he was looking at the checks and balances that form in these representative systems, because Kant was alive to be able to see what the Constitution was, that these checks and balances act as brakes on military force, and that the leaders in a democratic system are going to be held more accountable to become leaders and be elected. We also see that in order to get reelected or to maintain some sort of legacy, a leader would have to win that war. Otherwise, they could get thrown out of office and their legacy could be trashed because they didn't, quote unquote, win that war. And we're seeing that wars in today's world are becoming increasingly more difficult to win. So when you see that these criteria are on both sides, that if 2 democracies are both dealing with this, then it becomes even more and more unlikely that they would go to war together. And in fact, they haven't. That's why this democratic peace theory is very interesting in that it holds up. The United States, however, has most often been at war since 1945 with non-democracies, and there could be some motivations there to spread democracy around the world. It is an intriguing idea that if all the countries in the world were democracies, what would our world look like? How much conflict would there be? Potentially less conflict in the world if that was the case. Now, transitioning to a democracy is difficult. We'll get into that. I want to talk quite a bit more about democratization. But making that transition opens things up, a lot of competition, and can potentially unleash violence. A lot of groups coming to fore that perhaps were not recognized before, that want recognition now that we're transitioning to a democracy. So conflict, internal violence could pop up in that, which hinders the transition to democracy. In some cases, it actually prevents democracy from happening. Once it does happen, we see that democracies do commit less violence on their own citizens. Some more social theories to look at. Constructivism is a little bit more of a focused offshoot of institutionalism, where we're looking at the major actors are individuals with certain pursuits and ideas, collective identities, groups that are pursuing something that may be in their interest but have broad, long-range goals, and non-governmental organizations that are trying to address problems across borders that are spanning borders. So in this case, the interests are driven by shared ideas, increasing common knowledge of practical, scientific, respected ideas, social relations between groups, identities that are complex and changing, understanding that. So what we're seeing here is, hence its name, creating global structures, particularly through these shared ideas that could potentially lead in treaties, international law that's still evolving as we speak. Some of the things with constructivism is that this interaction across borders is evolving through social movements that may start up in one country but span across countries or gain attention across countries of shared ideas. Legal institutions such as regional courts, international courts, regional treaties that could come together on a larger scale to create more collective norms where people are agreeing more and more that peace is a collective good, or to protect the environment, to try to come together to prevent diseases from spreading across the world. So constructivism is building these structures through these types of ideas, which differs from institutionalism as to where the states are coming together to create these institutions. Here it's looking at it a little bit differently, still somewhat of a byproduct of institutionalism. Social theories, they all do have some common elements here. Marxism is looking at the world through unequal relations between classes, and fairly astute critic of capitalism. That's what Marx still brings to the table today, that even though capitalism has been relatively successful and we are seeing that the world is generally evolving into a global capitalist system, it still has its problems that we need to keep an eye on and take a look at. Marxism was very astute at looking at that. The major actors through Marxism are looking at the transnational elites that are calling the shots, these multinational corporations that are gaining more power and leverage, and then the idea that we've got rich versus poor states that are exacerbating the problem, and that the powerful states continue to oppress or exploit the weak. Now, it may not be that sinister that it was in Marx's day. We do see that in today's world, the rich and powerful states want to create a framework that's going to be in their image and in their interests. And so therefore, if we agree that it's in these poor states' best interest to get plugged into this system because it will help everybody as a whole or in general, and then obviously the powerful states are going to be calling the shots, it may not necessarily be for the intent to oppress or exploit the poor states. The workers, still worth looking at in today's world, that the workers do not share in the surplus that's created from this capitalist system. Marxist criticisms are still valid in looking at the externalities of capitalism that we need to potentially regulate, keep an eye on, alleviate. The world, as I said, is potentially moving towards a global capitalist system, and it has shown some success. Once China got plugged into it back in the late 70s, early 80s, they brought over 1 billion people out of poverty and still pursuing that. It's more of a controlled capitalism. We'll get into that, talk about those things more in detail later. And we could also say that Marx did flexibility or adaptability of market systems, or even the idea that a common worker could own stock in their corporation. But we've got to take a look at this from all sides, but relevant views still here from the Marxist perspective. Peace studies are looking at it also from a slightly different perspective in order to understand why and how peace could be achieved, or why it's so difficult to achieve, focusing more on individual responsibility, the economic inequalities of the world, gender relations, cross-cultural understandings, the concept of conflict resolution, particularly even at a local level, mediation, arbitration through a neutral broker. So even if we do not have a successful system of international law or a treaty that everybody is bought in on, perhaps we could still go through mediation, arbitration boards, things like that to resolve conflict. Peace studies are also looking at war as not necessarily a natural human expression, even though many social psychologists, or even such as Freud, looked at man, and I say man in general, having perhaps a natural tendency towards aggression or conflict. But we also do know that man has a natural tendency towards cooperation as well. And that war does not necessarily come out of this natural expression of human nature, but from the influence of leaders and ideologies that are promoting militarism, the glorification of war being socialized into a system where war is somewhat accepted to protect our interest or protect our identity, to fight for what's ours, things like that, or the idea that war is still noble or manly for men to go into in pursuit of, glorification of that, or even the leaders exploiting the fears of foreigners or the concepts of nationalism or patriotism that could expand into war. Peace studies are looking at trying to resolve these underlying reasons for war, such as poverty, hunger, oppression of one group over another group. This could be within states or between states. Also, transformation of relationships more or less at the human level, particularly through peace movements, which are started mostly at the grassroots level and then potentially expand across borders. Also looking at strengthening the norms against violence, coming together where people are agreeing on ideas that would prevent or minimize violence. Gender theories are looking at the world from the perspective of the differences between men and women, not necessarily the inequality that's been recognized for a long time. We live in a world that is male dominated. Every society in the world is patriarchal, and that it's male dominated, and that in many states women are still oppressed or not given equal opportunities. Even in the United States, women make less than men on average. So we know that. And what these gender theories are looking at is the world may be like it is because of the way men interact, considering that for the past 10,000 years or more, since we've started to form modern civilization, men have been in charge. So these concepts of anarchy and sovereignty reflect the male psyche in a way, as men have been in charge. Men generally find separation easier than interaction, and that this autonomy parallels the masculine psyche, where I'm protecting my territory. So that's not necessarily saying that men bad, women good. This is trying to understand the world as it is because of the fact that men have been in charge for so long. However, that does not mean that if women were in charge, there'd be no war. Well, for one, there's no evidence that women in power would necessarily prefer reconciliation or nonviolence, because we do have some examples. There's table 3.1 there of some women leaders who inherited a situation where they had to be fairly aggressive. For example, Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, even Margaret Thatcher, which engaged in the Falkland Islands War. Also, I wanted to mention that with men in charge, there has been a link between testosterone and aggression. So that's part of what we're studying here as to why conflict, separation, sovereignty, anarchy does seem to be the reigning norm because of men being the ones that developed it over many centuries. But if women were in charge, we have a relatively small data set to compare with. Women are being brought into a system that they were socialized into with men in charge and may have no choice but to do some things that society may be expecting them to do. And they may be surrounded by male advisors, predominantly male systems of government. They, in fact, may have inherited that position because they were the spouse of the previous leader. That's something that would remain to be seen as more and more women get in positions of leadership. We do know that women, when they're surveyed, women do have a typically less support of military actions. So you could perhaps predict that if more women were in charge, there might be fewer military actions. Hard to know for sure. But we also know that under our current system, is male dominated, particularly military and particularly governance. Military is 85% male, and that perhaps also is a result of long-standing norms in our society of keeping women out of violent conflict. That is changing a little bit as we speak. But in governance, the U.S. Senate, for example, is 80% male. We did see an interesting spike in the 2018 elections where more women were elected to U.S. Congress than ever before, but yet we're still looking at overall 25% of the entire U.S. Congress is female. And when you look at leadership in corporate world, of the Fortune 500 companies, only 7% of those have a woman CEO. So still a long way to go. Now, in other countries where it is even more patriarchal, in conflictual situations, women are often seen as military targets, as a symbol, perhaps, systematic rape for a male-dominated society to express their dominance over another group. The male role as protector is still something that, if I was in class, I might even poll the class that some men may still be socialized into a system of the United States to where they're raised to expect themselves to be the protector and the provider of their family. That still is a fairly strong norm, you could say. And this may be reaching a little bit further out there, but the phallic character of weapons in battle and in conflict is also something that could be a product of this as well. Quotas are somewhat controversial in that some states, 59 countries require women to hold a certain number of their seats in government. Afghanistan is an example where when they developed a new system after the Afghanistan war, they required a certain number of women to sit in their parliament. However, those women are still separated and put in their own area there and really not given as much power or the opportunity to lead in a male-dominated society. And ironically, that women make up half the populations in almost every society in the world, but yet a very, very small number in their leaderships. So would quotas potentially speed up their acceptance or create animosity? Even in the United States, you would probably sense that in general, United States society would be against having this imposed upon them. Yet in other countries where women are even more oppressed or have even less rights, this concept of gender inequality has been deemed somewhat of a Western-oriented concept that came about from these Western democratic capitalist type societies that then plugged their women into society and saw enormous benefits from that, but yet feel like that maybe they're imposing this Western concept onto them and may be reluctant to make those strides as far as gender inequality goes. So what we've talked about here is several different theories, social theories, institutionalism, peace studies, gender studies, and contrasted that to the realist perspective. And what I will do for the next lecture is depart from the book just a little bit and go further into a history lesson and talk about how this modern state evolved over time, this concept of anarchic sovereign states that we live in the world today. Where did that come from?